Darthvegan here, back with another series of Kerbal Space Program tutorials. I want to start from the very beginning and give you some basic getting started knowledge, and then we'll move on through the series, achieving orbits and rescuing a Kerbal and some other things that are helpful to know the first time you're playing Kerbal Space Program. So the first thing I want to point out when you first get started here on your home screen is that you want to go into settings, and in your general tab you want to come down here to advanced tweakables and make sure that is checked. So check the advanced tweakables, accept that, come back, and then go back to the loading screen here. Now I highly recommend that you download a couple of mods to make your game more enjoyable, and I'll put those mods in the description below. But the number one mod I think all players need, and almost you can't hardly play the game without it, or at least I don't think so, is Kerbal Engineer Redux, and this gives you a lot of flexibility inside the game that you really need in order to make it more enjoyable, I think. And they've made some strides toward adding some of the features of Kerbal Engineer Redux to the base game, but I think it still has a long way to go in order to make it, well, I just think they should include it in the base game myself. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. Alright, so the first thing you want to do is I recommend starting on career mode, because if you start off in sandbox mode, it tends to, I think you can jump ahead too quickly and you can get frustrated because you don't really understand what you're doing. And I think starting in career mode, I think it gives you a nice new feeling on how to do simple rockets, which leads to how to do more advanced rockets. So anyway, we're going to start a new game. We're going to do a tutorial mission. A tutorial career. And in this screen here, you name your save. You want to choose career or science, either way. But I think science will give you, you have to unlock your new parts by gathering scientific data. On the career mode, you have to have funds as well. But I think career mode is the best way to learn, to tell you the truth. So I highly recommend using career mode or science, but career mode I think is the best. Then you can choose your flag over here. There's some tutorials on how to make your own flag, and I'm not going to go over that, but I'm going to use my own flag on that. And then we're going to go ahead and start the game. Okay, and once you first get started, you got Gene Kerman here, and he's going to give you some little tutorials as you get started, but you can read that. He gives you some basic controls and things like that, but I'm going to go over all of the items in the Space Center here so that you'll kind of know what you're getting into and give you some basic feedback on all the different controls. Alright, so we're going to say thanks, I've got it. And the first thing I want to talk about is your user interface here. So here is your Kerbucks, your credits, your money, whatever you want to call it. I think they call it bucks or something. I don't remember exactly what they call it, but these are your funds. And then the second bar here is your reputation. So as you do missions and do things, your reputation grows to the right and you get more famous. This basically has to do with what kind of contracts you get and that kind of thing. And you can also do some things with your reputation to get more science and more funds. And we'll talk about that here in a moment. And then this last column here is your science. So this science is what you can use to unlock research. Alright, and then over on your left here is your time. And this is the speed of the game, and then you can click on this button to go to the next morning if you want to wait till day, or if you wanted to wait if you're in the middle of the night or something. And then this is your Space Center. So all of these buildings have a purpose, and then you can also click on these icons to the left to use the same function as these buildings, but we'll talk about all of them here very individually. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the vehicle assembly building. This is where you design and build all your spacecraft. So you simply left click on the building to go into the assembly building, and then you get another very short tutorial on how to do things, but you just click on got it there. And then we'll talk about what we have here as well. So this is where you build your spacecraft. And in order to start building a spacecraft, you first have to have a way to control the spacecraft. So that's always the first part you have to push down. And when you first get started, I think I've got the history mod. So some of these, if you just have the basic game, you may not have all the same parts that I have, but don't worry about that. I'll just try to stick to the basic parts. So the first thing you want to put down on your first rocket is an MK1 command pod. The MK1 command pod, if you highlight over it, it gives you some stats over it. You right click on it and it gives you, kind of gives it a pin so that you can take a look at it. But it gives you all the different things that this thing can do. But the most important thing to know about it is that this can control your spacecraft. All right. So this particular part holds one Kerbal, and it has an antenna internally built in. It has a reaction wheel built in, and I'll talk about that here in a moment. It has 50 electric charge stored in it. It has a tiny bit of monopropellant, and that's it. And it costs 600 funds. So as you can see, I added the command pod to our building here, to our spaceship, and now you can see it shows what that costs. This is the cost, and this is your total funds that you have. And then up here, you can name your craft. So I'm going to name this the DVS Tutorial 1. All right, so this is just a command pod, and it has no method of flight or propulsion or anything. So if we launched this craft here, it would basically just sit out on the launch pad and do nothing. So we're going to go ahead and click on these icons here. The first one is the build. The second one is crew, so that determines what Kerbals you can put in your spacecraft. By default, Jebediah Kerman, the pilot, goes in there. We also start with Bill, who's an engineer, Bob, who's a scientist, and Valentina, who is also a pilot. And then this last button, Switch Editor, is to change to the airplane hangar, which we'll talk about that, or space plane hangar. We'll talk about that here in a moment. But we're going to stick with the vehicle assembly building for now. This is the Kerbal Engineering Redux, and I'll talk about it very briefly. We need a whole separate tutorial just for it, but it really helps you design your rocket a lot more efficiently. And so we'll talk about that. Down here on the left is your symmetry count. So if you want to add parts, more parts symmetrically to your ship, you can click on this, or you can press the X key to cycle through however many parts you want to add, and that gets really handy when you're adding multiple parts. Down here is the snap key. So if you take like one of these mystery goo containment science units, with the snap on, you can see as I move my mouse, it snaps into place into the next logical location. If you turn it on to smooth, which just looks like a circle, you can really place it anywhere. And so it's really good to fine-tune your placement. But with this mystery goo, which is a science, we can press it here, and I'll press X to put on 2 symmetry, and you can see now I have 2 parts, 3 parts, 4 parts, 5 parts, 6 parts, well, whatever. So that's what that does. And then we'll just go through all of these categories here and talk about them very briefly. So the first one is the pods. It's your controls. Once you get AI controls, they'll be in here as well. The second one is fuel tanks. Once you get some fuel tanks, they will be in this category. The third one is engines. It's what makes you go. The next one is command and control. It's a way to manipulate your rocket ship around. The next one is structural. So there'll be like non-essential parts, but like connectors and things like that. Coupling is a way to detach parts from your rocket. Payload is what uses to store things in your rocket. Aerodynamics are basic things like fins. So we'll go ahead and put a couple of fins on this bad boy. We'll put on 4 symmetrical. Like that. Ground will be like landing gear. Thermal is like heat shields. Electrical is like batteries and solar panels. Communications like antennas. Science is a way to get science. Alright, so we'll put it back on dual symmetry here. We'll put it back on 2. We'll put 2 mystery goos on there. And then very finally is utility, and this is like parachutes and lights and other things like that. So we'll pop a parachute on there. So our first rocket here is going to be the very, very basic command pod and a solid rocket booster, some fins, and some science, and a parachute. If you have a Kerbal on board, you always want a parachute. Or it will be unpleasant for your Kerbals. Okay. Alright, so over here you have, by default, it's on the placement tool. Then the next one is the movement tool. So you can click on a part that you want to move, and you can slide it into your rocket, or if you want to toggle it on smooth, you can slide it in so that less of the part is exposed, or you can move it up and down. It's just a fine-tuning mechanism. The next one is the rotate tool, and you can use it to spin the part around however you want to, whatever makes you feel better about the placement of that rocket. And that's really handy when you're kind of designing some funky stuff. The next one is reroute tool. By default, your command pod is always your route, but sometimes you want something else to be the route, and so you would click on your former route, and then you can click on the new route. So now if I click on this flea solid rocket booster, it moves the entire ship, whereas previously you had to connect on the command pod to do that. So we're going to go back, we're going to take these off and replace them on there so that they're nice and cleanly snapped on. Let's put snap back on. Get that back to 2. Alright, there we go. Alright, so we're going to talk about now is your staging. Alright, so each stage of your rocket behaves separately, and you want that stage to do a specific function, and then you want to go on to the stage that is next. So this first rocket, it has one stage right now. So if we were to launch this rocket, it would perform 2 functions at once. The solid rocket booster, which I'm highlighting over here on the right, would fire, but at the same time the parachute would fire, and we don't want that. We want to fire the parachute separately. So in order to do that, if you highlight on your staging over here, you see this plus and minus. We will add a stage on there, and the first thing we want to happen is we want the rocket booster to fire first. So we're going to fire the rocket booster, and then the second stage will be the parachute. Alright, so that's how you do that. When you get the rocket that you want put together, you can save it, which we'll go ahead and save this design here. And then the other important thing is the launch. Now, before we do the launch, I want to talk a little bit about the engineering Redux. The Redux here shows you how many stages you have, how much it costs, the parts, the mass of that ship, the ISP, which is kind of your, not really your thrust, it's your energy. This is your thrust, this is your torque, your thrust to weight ratio, your DeltaV, and your burn time. Alright, so the things I pay the most attention to are the torque. So if you have something that is off balance on your ship, so let's just put on an extra mystery goo here. We'll put it over here. I put that extra mystery goo now, so the rocket is no longer balanced, and you can see we have 1.37 kilonewton per meter of torque, which means since it's heavier on this side of the rocket, it will tend to lean over towards that side. So you always want to keep it as close to 0 as possible, especially in the very early stages of your rocket. The thrust to weight ratio is just basically saying, can this rocket lift its own weight? All right. So right now it's 7.58 thrust to weight ratio means that I can lift up 7.5 times the weight with the thrust that I have here. So that means that this sucker will really launch off. You always want it to be above 1 or you won't get off the launch pad. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. The DeltaV is how much energy can I expend to move this rocket through air and space. Alright, so 845 meters per second means that I can expend 845 meters per second worth of force to move this rocket through time and space. So you'll see a little bit what that means, but each maneuver costs DeltaV. So it takes approximately 35 to 3800 DeltaV to get into an orbit. So you can see we're well short of that with this. And this particular thruster with this weight on this rocket will burn for 8.8 seconds. So we're going to go ahead and save this rocket. We're going to go out to the launch pad, which is the second building I want to talk about, and probably the second most important building in the game. So the launch pad is where you launch all of your rockets. So when you click to launch, you come out to this very basic launch pad. Here's just a concrete slab on some sand with some scorch marks. And you'll see you've got a few additional controls that we didn't have previously. For one, you can see Jebediah Kerman down here happy as a little lamb. And you can click on him. There's a few extra buttons you can see here. View is to see what it looks like inside the cockpit. Alright, so you can look around by holding down the right mouse button. And you can see all the different controls. And you can actually fly from here if you're brave enough. I never do, because I'm not good enough. But yeah, you've got all the same instruments here that you do on the outside view. But to get back to the outside view, you press the C button. Alright, so then you're back here. Down here in the middle is basically what you use to fly your ship. It's called a nav ball. And the nav ball is this little V shape with a dot in the middle is the direction your ship is pointing. Okay, so right now we're pointing up into the sky. And if you use WASD to control your ship, you can kind of rock it back and forth. It's very well, I guess you can't really see the rocking because it's too heavy, but I can press Q and E to rotate. Very slightly you can move while you're on the ground. But yeah, this is what you use to control your rocket. And as you try to move around, you can see the pitch and the yaw and the roll moving over here as well. And then these are your stagings. You press the space bar to initiate each stage. So the first stage will be our solid rocket booster for 719 meters per second. And then the next stage will be our parachute. All right. And then up here is how thick the atmosphere is. So as you get higher, the atmosphere gets thinner and thinner. 70,000 meters on Kerbal is where you get outside of the atmosphere. And then this is how high you are right now. We're 68 meters even though we're on the ground, we're 68 meters above sea level. So that's a pretty useful little tool. And then this is our speed. And you can see as we get close to the top here with our mouse, we get a little drop down where you can go back to the Space Center and leave this vessel on the launch pad, or you can recover vessel and you can get him back here. So one of the things to remember when you're doing your first rockets is that you don't have very many parts to choose from. And so you want to get as much science as you can. And I'm going to make the next tutorial about easy science. But this first tutorial, we're just going to talk about controls and building your first rocket. So what I usually do is I try to get as much science, but we're not going to do that in this tutorial. We're just going to talk about getting your first rocket off the ground. So we typically have two other controls that we can use with a rocket. One is called the RCS. And what you use with RCS is monopropellant stored in your vessel here, and you can use it to shoot air out, or shoot the monopropellant out to guide your vessel. This particular ship, I don't believe, has any monopropellant thrusters. It does have some monopropellant stored, but no thrusters. So you can't actually use RCS with this first vessel. The second one is SAS, and an SAS is stability assist. And by default, it just kind of keeps your ship pointing in the direction of its travel. So it just keeps you from flopping around whenever you launch. So it's pretty handy. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with our first launch. So we've got our solid rocket booster here ready as the first stage, with the parachute as the second stage. Jebediah Kerman is happy and ready, and we'll talk about EVA here in a moment. But we're going to scroll out with our mouse wheel a little bit so we can get a good view of the rocket. We can look around with the right mouse button, and then you can also click on your parts to do some variety of functions to get more science and things like that. But this first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about launching the rocket. So we're going to press the space bar, and we're going to get ready to launch in 3, 2, 1, space bar. And you can see this little booster is super quick, but it doesn't have much fuel. So it's just basically going to shoot us up as fast as possible. And then we're going to run out of fuel, and it is now, it's done. But we're going fast enough that we're going to fly up, I don't know, maybe 10, 12,000 meters. And you can see our speed is decreasing now that we're out of fuel. And we're nice and high here. We're still climbing. You can see I can use my WASD keys now to move around. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what these icons are. This icon with the circle with the 2 bars to the sides and 1 bar on top is your prograde vector. That means that's the direction your ship is flying in right now. So whenever you're thrusting, you always want to keep the nose of your ship pointed in the same direction as prograde. Retrograde is these 2 marked down at an angle with an X to it. That means that is the opposite way your ship is moving. So it's hard to keep it on retrograde because we're falling. So our ship naturally wants to point our nose down towards prograde. But that's what those 2 symbols mean. And the nav ball, of course, is brown as the dirt and blue as the sky. So we're falling down pretty fast now, and the next stage we want to deploy is our parachute. So we want, by default, our parachute, if we right click on it, it will deploy. If we press the space bar, our chute will come out. And you can see it's not deployed, and it won't deploy until you're about 1,000 meters over sea level. Now it's important to remember the difference between 1,000 meters over sea level and 1,000 meters over ground level, especially if there's a lot of mountains around. So you can see we barely slowed down in time to land without crashing this thing, but I normally would deploy the parachute a little sooner than that, but I'm just demonstrating here. The first rocket launch, and that's how you get your rocket off the ground. All right, then once we get on the ground, you can do an EVA, and you can take him out and climb around and jump around and have some fun, but we're not going to do that this time. You can do some science and things like that, but that's going to be for another episode. All right, so now that we're back on the ground, safe and sound, we didn't do any science, but we're going to go ahead and recover the vessel, and that's your first ship. All right, so now that we've done our first ship, we're going to recover the vessel, and it gives you a little bit like a mission debriefing here. We earned 5 science just for doing that without doing any scientific experiments because we did stuff we'd never done before. We recovered a vessel that survived a flight, so we got 5 science. So we click next, and it tells us about the parts that we have. When you recover a vessel, the closer you are to the Space Center, the more funds you get back from those recovered parts. So we got 2,781 funds back from the ship. And so that's good. And you get the more stuff that's left on your ship, the more funds you get back. And then of course we got, and you can see here we're close enough to the KSC that we got 98% of the value back of the parts. And then crew tells you any experience you get for your flight. Now it's kind of you got 1 experience point, but really the best experience you can have are a few milestones, and the milestones for experience are planting a flag on a body, that's the highest. Orbiting a body is the next highest. Flying on that body, and then I guess that's it. Those are the things that you can get experience for. All right, so now that's 2 of the buildings, the Launchpad and the Vehicle Assembly Building. The next building I want to talk about is probably the next most important, and that is the Tracking Station. The Tracking Station, if you click on it, and don't pay any mind to these extra mods I have here. The Tracking Station here is, it shows you on a map of your solar system. You can kind of scroll out and see the entire solar system. It shows you all of your vessels that you have currently in flight. And it shows how long they've been in flight and a lot of different stats about them. But since we don't have any, that doesn't mean much to you right now. All right. And then the next building we want to talk about, another very important building, is the Research and Development Building. So if you click on it, this is your technology tree. All right. So you start here, and then you can research items. As you get science, you can unlock more and more parts. So the first things obviously you want to unlock are your basic rocketry parts, which are a liquid fuel engine and a fuel tank and another solid fuel booster. And then also you can get a decoupler, some more science, a thermometer, an antenna, and then two different kinds of antenna. So for 10 science, you can get both of these unlocked. All right. So we'll go ahead and unlock these. We're going to click on research. That will take 5 science. And we'll click on this engineering, and that'll take another 5 science. Now these next parts, they are a variety of different science to require to unlock. One is the survivability, and it gives you some additional heat shields, some more science, some radiators, some basic landing gear, some additional parachutes, a service bay to store parts in, and that is 15 science. The next one, stability, is 18 science, and it gives you some radial decouplers, some winglets, and a nose cone. That's pretty good. That's 18 science. And then the general rocketry for 20 science is a little better engine, some more solid fuel boosters, and a bigger fuel tank. So these are things to strive toward and good to get in order to make your rockets more advanced. And we'll talk about that a little more in subsequent tutorials. All right. Now the next building we want to talk about is the astronaut complex. The astronaut complex is where you keep all your astronauts. So by default, you start with these 4 astronauts, and they all have different things they can do. So you can, if we highlight over Jebediah, you can see that he has had a flight at Kerbin equals 1. That's the lowest level of experience you can get for a planetary body. So he has 1 experience point for that. So if he were to get into orbit of Kerbin, he would get another experience point. If he planted a flag on Kerbin, he would get another experience point. All right. So for each planetary body, you want to try to achieve all 3 of those things to get your all of your Kerbals as advanced as possible. And as they increase in level, they get more abilities that they can do and are more efficient. All right. The next building we're going to talk about is the flagpole. That's just where you choose your flag. All right. But you can get science from, I'll talk about that on the science. The flagpole is where you choose your flag. The next building is the administration building. Now the administration building is, it's not super important. It's to use your different categories of currency, if you want to think of it that way, to get other forms of currency. So you have 3 forms of currency. You got funds, reputation, and science. And you can use these different programs to trade one of these currencies for another. So if you wanted, for each mission you do, you can take 5% of your reputation gains and give you funds, for example, or you can use reputation for science or science for funds, or there's a variety of different things. And you could do this to kind of get small gains on your missions. The next thing we want to talk about is the space plane hangar. It's just like the vehicle assembly building, only with the space plane hangar, it's all horizontally focused so that you can build airplanes or rovers. All right, so not much to talk about there. Basically the same. And we'll go over space plane building in a later episode. And then very lastly is the runway. Actually, it's not last. It's next to last. The runway. The runway is just like the launch pad, only it's for horizontal takeoff of space planes. And then very lastly, finally, is the mission control. Mission control is where you can come to get missions if you're in career mode. That's kind of why I like career mode. It gives you a little opportunity to do some fun things. Like for example, if we click here, Orbit Kerbin is one of the first missions you can get, and it will give you, if you achieve the goal of getting out of the atmosphere and achieving an orbit of Kerbin, you'll get 48,000 funds, 6 science, and 10 reputation. Oh, actually, you get an advance of 16,800 funds, to help complete the mission. And then you'll also get 31,200, 6 science, and 10 reputation. So in total, you get 48,000 funds. So some things you can get different amounts of science and funds for doing them. And then for some of them, if you fail to do them in the time that they give you, then you get penalized in some way. All right, so you can do these very simple. Some of them seem simple, but they're a little more difficult than others. If you get any science, for example, from Kerbin, you get 6,400 credits, 1 science and 2 reputation. So when you first start, you can only have 2 contracts active. You can accept this contract, and then you go to active, and it tells you that that's one of your active contracts. All right, so for each building, you can right-click on it, and you can see that you can do an upgrade, and each upgrade performs a certain function for that building. One of the first things you'll need to do is to upgrade your launch pad, because you can only have a vessel weight of 18 tons and a max vessel size of 20 meters here on the first stage of the launch pad. So it's very difficult to make big rockets at the very first of the game there. All right, so we're going to go back into the vehicle assembly building. We made our first rocket, we made our first launch, and now we're going to give you our second launch here. So we're going to call this the DVS tutorial 2, and this is really just going to demonstrate some of the basic parts that we just unlocked. And we're going to go to the fuel tanks. We're going to pop on a few of these fuel tanks here, and I'll show you. We'll put on 3 of them on there, and then we'll put on the swivel rocket booster, and you can see that we only have 1 stage here, but with these 3 fuel tanks and with this swivel rocket engine here, which gives us 215 thrust in the vacuum and 167 thrust in an atmosphere, with this little guy here, it gives us, with 3 fuel tanks, 1462 DeltaV. So that's more than the flea gave us, so that's good. The hammer, for example, would give us, oops, let's take this off. The hammer, which is another solid rocket fuel booster, gives us 1948. Almost enough to get into orbit, but not quite. Alright, so we can actually put these guys on here, and we can get more fuel on there. And the more fuel you have, the more mass your rocket has. Alright, so if we look down here at this little gear icon, it tells you how many parts you have. We have 6 out of 30 right now, and the mass is 3.6 tons out of 18 tons. So we can't exceed any of those with our current design of our launch pad or our vehicle assembly building. So now we're up to 2084 DeltaV. So let's just add a couple more and see if we can get into orbit with this very, very basic rocket. And I'll do a tutorial over getting into orbit separately, but I'd like to see if we can just design a rocket with enough DeltaV. That's 3101, getting close. No, we're still got plenty of parts left. One little tip here is that if you highlight over a group of parts, so you can see I've got 4 of these fuel tanks highlighted. If I just by clicking on, or highlighting over with my mouse, if I hold down the Alt key and then left click, it will kind of clone those parts, so you don't have to add one part at a time. This is 3736 DeltaV. This will definitely get us into orbit. We're not used our maximum parts. We've not used our maximum weight. This throws some aerodynamics on this, because this will be a pretty hard rocket to fly, I'm afraid. But we're going to give it a shot. Alright, so we're going to put Jebediah on here. Yep, he's in there. We do want to have a nice little parachute. And one thing I wanted to show you that I didn't show you at the very first rocket is if you have Kerbal Engineering highlighted or installed, you have to add one of these parts to each one of your ships in order to use Kerbal Engineer mod to its full functionality, unless you click on the Kerbal Engineer button here, go into the settings, and there is a setting in here so that you do not have to have one of the Kerbal Engineering systems in order to use the mod. So by default it's on career. If you click here and put it on partless, and then click out of the settings, you don't have to include these parts. And we're going to go out here, we're going to save this, we're going to go out to our rocket. I'm just going to show you what that adds to our design here. Okay, so you can now see there's additional information added to our flight controls here, including this nice little box here. So just explain this right quick. Here is our apoapsis height. The apoapsis of a flight is the maximum height that vessel will achieve with your current trajectory. All right, so right now it's at 73.6 meters because we're sitting still on the launch pad, and that's how tall we are, and we're not moving. As we fly, this will increase the more thrust we use until we've used up all of our thrust, and it will tell you how high you can fly at a maximum. So this is very useful whenever you start getting started making orbits, getting orbits achieved. The periapsis is the minimum height of your flight trajectory. All right. So typically, in order to be in orbit of Kerbin, your apoapsis has to be higher than 70,000 meters, and the periapsis has to be higher than 70,000 meters, or else you'll start hitting atmosphere and be dragged back down into Kerbin's atmosphere, eventually landing on the ground. Over here is your true altitude and your vertical speed and your horizontal speed, what biome you're over, which is useful when you're getting science, and what situation you're in right now. So the altitude is your actual height above sea level. Right now we're 11.4 meters. Or is relative to sea level, excuse me. This is your height above sea level, which includes the terrain you're on. So the thing that makes this important is if your parachute is set to expand at 1,000 meters and you're over terrain that is 2,000 meters above sea level, you might smash into the ground before your parachute ever even deploys. So it's very useful to have this additional piece of information. Over here is the flight engineering little toolbox. You can see some different stats about your planet that you're on, or the vessel that you're flying, and some of the different things that you can do. We'll talk about them more in depth as we're doing different things. But you can see my staging is messed up, so I want to fix that. And you can change your staging while you're in flight or while you're on the launch pad. So you always want to make sure your staging is correct before you press the space bar to begin your flight. And you always want to make sure your SAS is on. And with liquid fuel engines, which is what I have now, you always want to use the space bar to increase incrementally your throttle, and the control key decreases incrementally your throttle. The X key kills your throttle, and the Z key maxes out your throttle. So that's some additional things you can use with controls that we previously didn't have with the solid rocket fuel booster, because there's no controls on that thing. And you can see I can wiggle my rocket a little bit with my reaction wheel in my pod here, but you want to be careful that you don't want to wiggle it too much. But yeah, Jebediah, he's happy, he's ready. That was your first rocket. This is your second rocket, and we will talk about it more in achieving an orbit. But I hope you enjoyed this first tutorial. If you did, throw me some likes, leave me some comments, and as always, subscribe to my channel, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.